Let's get comfortable with the uncomfortable. Today on the Prenup podcast with Logan Gentry, executive coach and former pastor.
Welcome to another episode of the Prenup podcast. Today I have Logan Gentry with us. He is a philanthropist, a life coach, and also a former pastor. So, Logan, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I think you did a good job there. Yeah, on the philanthropy side, my hope is to get more people to be a part of giving. That there's joy and generosity, and we want everyone to experience that, and that makes an impact on the world. And then on the executive coaching side, I kind of came to that. My first career was actually as a civil engineer, and so I have an engineering background. Then I became a pastor, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you bring them together in my executive coaching, it's kind of life and business therapy. But I have 3 phenomenal kids. I'm divorced and hopeful for the future. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, where are you born?
I'm a Texan, so I was born in Houston, and only child to parents who were a little bit older by Houston standards. So my mom was 38 at the time, and so back then that was a big deal. And so all of her friends, are like a decade younger because they were friends with my peers. So yeah, I grew up as an only child, not from a family of faith. I came to the Christian faith through sports. Sports was religion in our home. I got sent to a sports camp. It was a Christian sports camp, and that's how I got introduced to faith and set me on a journey of trying to figure out who God is and how do I live according to faith. I was 13, so I came home from camp and was like, I know we're not Christian, but I gave my life to God. Can you take me to church?
What did parents say? What was their reaction?
Oh, this is the benefit of being an only child is that they're supportive no matter what. So they were great. They drove me and picked me up. They attended occasionally. They engaged in the conversation, but my mom was a very strong feminist woman, and she felt that the Bible spoke really poorly about women, and so we had a lot of conversations about that. My dad was kind of agnostic and couldn't really care less about it. So
Was he kind of like, okay, as long as you're happy, I'm happy.
absolutely, they were fully supportive, which was nice.
I love that. Okay, so middle school and then high school, and then you were
Went to Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas.
at the sports when you were in college.
No, I mean for fun, but no, it was just I went there for engineering and went there with all my friends. No sports in college.
And you continued on with your, kind of journey in your faith and graduated and you started to go into engineering after graduation.
Yeah, I explored going to seminary, which is the traditional route for someone who's going to go into ministry. But I felt like if I went to seminary, I'd get caught up in a lot of theological debate and that my soul would die, which I was not interested in. I was more interested in more of the practical application of spirituality. Like, how do you live this out? And so I decided to not go to seminary, moved to Austin, got married right out of college. And I started working as a civil engineer and serving in a local church that was growing into a mega church. And so I was a part of helping build out all of their ministries. And that was kind of my ministry training in Austin. But always wanted to be in the Northeast. And so 5 years later, had an opportunity to leave engineering and become a pastor in New York City. And so moved and left it all behind, left the house on a cul-de-sac, had 2 kids at the time, one on the way, moved to New York City. And everyone thought I was completely insane.
And so, okay, so at the time you were married
Yes.
and your wife, was she like, let's do it? Or was she like, oh my goodness, what are you getting us into?
Yeah, it was actually part of our dream to come to the Northeast. For her, New York was part of that dream. Her family is originally from here, and so that was the hope is that we could come back to New York, more of a diverse city for our own faith and growing our kids in their own faith around a more diverse environment. So it was their choice, not cultural. But then also to be a part of the church here, which is again not popular, but a chance to kind of engage people that don't agree with us.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I grew up going Catholic school. Was never really too Catholic, but my mom is whatever religion she wants to be that week. Um,
Love it.
but it's interesting in New York. There's really at least in my friend group, there's not like a strong religious community per se in the city. I have like 1 or 2 friends that have dabbled with uh, getting back into religion, and it lasts for about 4 to 6 months, and then they fade away. But I actually have one or two friends who are really good with Jewish religion, and they're very devout. And but that is, it's interesting. There's more of those types of communities here than there are Christian communities. And I think what's so like I love about some of my really fellow Jewish friends is the community
Yes.
built up in New York. It's like wonderful and it's amazing. And there 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 is some ethos there, which it's interesting us to how was it for you coming in as like a Christian pastor to New York? Different, not different, interesting to be in like a city instead of a small community. What was the vibe?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, the Jewish community and the Catholic communities has a lot of history in New York City, and so there is a lot of family culture. It is more predominant in the Protestant world. Instead of what my was doing was church planting, so it was church startup world, and so it was non-denominational, meaning that it was not affiliated with any mainline denomination. So it was kind of like a starter church that was meant to get everybody involved. And so they were smaller churches. None of the churches I was a part of were more than 200 to 250 people. And there were a lot of people that were transplants that had faith that they came to the city with, or faith in their background that they were returning to explore. And so as a result, that was the majority of the congregations that we were a part of. And I think for a lot of people, it was figuring out how does faith interact with culture? Because New York has such a strong, dominant culture that's not defined by Christian faith. And so, honestly, I found that it was super helpful because it forced you to be more nuanced with your faith instead of black and white. Because I think in other cultural religious environments, things can be very black and white. And so to come to an environment like New York and have to wrestle with people that are just as good as you, right? Because part of faith, there's this feeling of like, oh, I've figured it out. It's like, actually, they're kinder, more loving, they serve more than you, and they don't share your faith. How do you wrestle with that? And so it really helps people consider what do they actually believe and how does that define their life? So for me, I enjoyed it because you weren't allowed to get away with cultural Christianity of I just attend, but it's like, how does that define how you go to work? How does it define how you live in apartment buildings here? Serve your neighbor. So it became, for me, a more real, tangible experience of spirituality.
And to actually be able to impact instead of being already maybe super accepting of accepting
Sure, or at least on the face, right? The surface. There's a lot of smiling and agreement, and then we'll live differently. So
Yeah, that's I mean, that's also like and I know we're here to talk about your prenups marriage partnership, which is there's a lot of that too, right? Which is okay, I'm gonna say one thing, but I'm gonna do another. It's
yeah.
like how do you grapple with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can live that way for long, and so I think it creates a tension, whether inside of a marriage or inside of faith. If you are saying one thing and wanting another, eventually that will break, and so you're constantly living in this tension that eventually will end, and so it's wrestling with what do you actually desire? How do you actually wanna live? And so it pushes you to make a choice. And so I worked with a lot of young professionals that, would find each other and then wanna get married, and so I did a lot of premarital counseling. I officiated. I was trying to count earlier today, probably over 35 weddings I've officiated. And always a part of the process was let's go through premarital, let's make a custom kind of wedding ceremony. Let's figure out what you want that to look like. Because I wanted them to wrestle with what were they getting into before they actually, said I do.
Okay, so let's get into
Okay.
because I am fascinated by this, right? One of the things in the past career research that I've been doing uh, is I joke, but don't joke that everyone these days is like getting married on a hilltop in Vermont and their uncle's the pastor, the officiant, because they went on like Jesus.com and got a certificate. And it's like, I can marry you on a hill.
Uh-huh.
Tell me more about the premarital counseling that you did. What type of questions were you asking? How could you tell a couple was like on the right path or if they weren't on the right path? Just give me a little bit.
Yeah, I would tell every couple that I met with that my goal was to break them up before they chose to get married. And if I couldn't break them up, that was a good sign.
I love that.
Because if I can do that just by asking questions and probing into the gaps of their relationship, life is going to destroy them because life is much harsher than I could ever be, inside of a premarital environment. And so my goal was to try to expose the gaps of things they hadn't discussed, hadn't considered, or were intentionally avoiding because they had different versions of what they wanted. And so often it would start with, hey, fast forward 10 years. What's the vision? What's the video that's playing in your mind of your future? Because everyone gets married with some sense of, I want to be with this person, but I also want to build a life with them.
Really.
So, but few of us kind of consider, what is your vision of that and what is mine? And are they aligned? Like, is it a city? Is it a suburb? Like, is it kids? Is it not kids? Is it kids and a dog and a white picket fence and we're sports family or hiking family? What are we? And I think people overlook that because love conquers all. And we want to make sure that we feel like romance doesn't need the pragmatism of what is reality eventually going to be. So I'd start with, what is that vision you see in the future? And then I would work through what's called a genogram. So a genogram is a counseling practice. It's essentially just a questionnaire, and it's meant to look back multiple generations into your family's history to say you're ultimately bringing your family as a default into your marriage. And so that's what you're going to fall back to. That's your baseline. Yeah, your patterns. How your parents, like, what was your relationship with your mom? What was your relationship with dad? What was your relationship to their marriage? And how did they relate to each other? So that's what you saw as your example of love. So the question that I would then present to them is, what do you want to repeat about your parents' marriage? And what do you want to redeem? What do you want to change? So if you want it to be the same, what aspects, but what would you like to be different? And those would bring up fascinating conversations. But then we would dig into particular topics. How was conflict handled in your home? Was it avoided? Was it loud? Was it quiet? Was it behind closed doors so you don't know? How was money handled? Was money a topic of scarcity or abundance? Was it fear based? Was it something that you felt like you knew about or didn't know about? It was hidden. How do we explore that? And then we go through sexuality, spirituality. What do you think about kids in the future? How do you want to raise your kids? So my goal was to go, let's just poke on each of these things, ultimately that a prenup would at least explore. But how does a premarital kind of counseling environment begin to address that? And I think with couples to work through that, the majority of them actually, I think they would come together in a more intimate space as a result of that counseling than than separate. And so it wasn't marriage proof, in terms of our divorce proof, but it did force them to wrestle with things that we don't want to talk about because we just want to be romantic about a wedding and things.
Were there any couples that went through this with you? Oh my God, wow.
No, I think by the time they got to me, I think many of them had the wedding date, the venue, and they're locked in. There was one couple that postponed their wedding about a year because through that it exposed issues with one of the people in the relationship that they both agreed you should work through that in counseling outside of marriage before we bring that into a marriage. And they ended up still getting married, but it was the healthiest thing they could have done was to post because
That's amazing. Yeah. Did you ever couples come to you like even before getting engaged? Be like, hey, we really love each other. We're thinking of taking this next step, but we're not sure we're ready to. Because something I'm starting to feel more and more is I used to be one of the people, it's not fun of people, any fun of them, but I couldn't totally grasp when I had couples in my sphere started doing couples counseling
while they were dating.
while they were dating.
Yeah.
In my mind, I was like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
There's no ring on it.
Yeah.
What's happening? And
I was always assuming that they're about to break up.
yeah, and the joke's on me is that the two couples I know who actually did couples counseling before they got married might be the two happiest couples within my orbit right now, which also shocked me because I did not see that coming.
Yeah, yeah. I think what I saw, because most of the churches I were in were more conservative in the evangelical space, and so the intensity of dating towards marriage is a little bit more serious in a lot of those environments. And so I think it was when people would start dating to a certain point, then it was kind of like everyone knew, and it was like an open conversation about that. And so there were a few people that came before engagement but it was always like right on the cusp. It was never, are we deciding to get engaged or not? It was, we're about to, so let's get started talking about some of these deeper things.
Um, did you ever in your ministry did did any of these couples even ever mention to you like that you should get a prenup?
Yes, I had a few couples that brought up the prenup conversation. One of them ended up, going through with it. It was just part of, it was what they knew inside their family. And the other, the it was a guy who brought up the prenup conversation, and then his fiancee, she just said she wasn't comfortable with the prenup. And so then we were kind of it was a lot of exploring like why. And so that was a lot of risk in there, and they ended up not getting the prenup. But part of the conversation was revealing what was behind the prenup in terms of what are the fears, there. And I think that it was just a lot of unspoken and assumed realities of how they were going to operate with career, with money, with where they wanted to live. And so they just hadn't talked about it. And so as they began to talk about it, he began to say like, okay, I'm okay with not going through with a prenup.
So you felt safer in the conversation? Do you guys get like as a pastor, are you really even talking finances really or is it service law? Like do you get if you ever hear like, hey, did you grow up with financial scarcity or did you grow up with extreme wealth and access? How do you
Yeah, I think we do use the language of scarcity or abundance. And part of that is that our declaration of faith would say like God is the provider and he loves to bless his people. And so his desire is that you would trust that he's going to provide an abundance and not live from a scarcity mindset. And so part of it is a how do you form your views of God out of scarcity and into abundance? But then the second layer of that in terms of a relationship is what is your expectation of a financial future? Is it dual income? Is it that one of you will stay home with the kids? Is that they'll stay home for the kids eventually, but they'll go back to work? Like, what is your default again about what you think the future is going to be? Because while we believe God will provide with abundance, there's no guarantee that you're going to live at the same stage of wealth or life status as you have been or as you were raised in. So, what is your expectation of that? And I don't in my experience, I watched a lot of couples that didn't really face that until after marriage when they were having kids. And then they started to wrestle with that conversation then. And by then they've set a certain life stages based on dual incomes and one of them now wants to stay home. And so then there's a big adjustment conversation that's a lot of fear and a lot of change. And then I think that introduces fear later that causes some problems because it begins to create some financial unsteadiness that is one of the biggest reasons that marriages crumble.
Yeah, okay, let's talk about that. So what is I'm so curious to hear from your perspective because I would assume you also have couples that come to you where, hey, my marriage is not working. This is why it's not working. How do I repair it or how do I gracefully exit? Like, what were some of the things that you saw that were really pivotal and or common when it came to these marriages kind of dissolving?
Yeah, and the marriages that were dissolving, I think a few things. They kind of boiled down to the private was not matching the public persona. That the Instagram couple that, behind closed doors actually could not stand each other, right, and could not get on the same page. So I think, sitting down with couples that faced infidelity and what do we do now? Like, can I trust this person going forward? I think the second piece that I saw a lot was just a drifting, if you want to use that language, apart once kids come into the picture, because when kids are 5 and under, it's just chaos. Like, that's the hardest time. And so you're basically ships passing in the night, so you haven't had a date night in years. Like, you're just kind of doing logistics. So both of you feel like you're being neglected. You're not looking at each other, seeing each other, loving each other the way you used to. And so you get to the point where you're like, I don't wanna do this anymore. And then I think the last piece I saw was one member of the couple, I'd say, just disappearing on the relationship. Either work was more exciting, and so they were rarely there. Even when they were there, they weren't present. And so eventually they just were just tired of it because that leads to sexless marriages. It leads to financial situations that feel weird of like you're hiding things and I don't know what you're doing or how you're spending your time and money. And so those are the things that people would kind of finally come to a head. And I would just always encourage people like don't don't walk away or walk out of the marriage without having the conversation first. That if you had the courage to stand up in front of people to say, I'm committing myself to you, have the courage and the behind the scenes to say, I no longer want to be in this. But, oftentimes people were really shocked when they were delivered divorce papers or they were told, I want a divorce, I'm leaving. And then that's the moment that everyone kind of gets like shattered and shook. Um,
You think there's something to be said about ego also being a problem? That's applied to people that wouldn't see it coming. Maybe they just, I don't know. I'm trying to, I feel like there's a few people out there that I've talked to in the past year who got to a point and they left their partner they were so miserable with the people who got left are like, "Wait, you're leaving me? Why are you leaving me? I did everything right." Blah 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 blah.
yeah, well, I can speak to that on kind of the religious perspective and a personal reality. I would say on the religious side, there's a tendency to kind of go like, oh, I trust God that it will get better. And you over spiritualize it. And I think there's also on the religious side an inability to be really direct and honest. That you've committed to this, so you're supposed to, right? There's a lot of shoulds inside of religion. So I should love this person, I should commit to it. And the more and more should becomes a reality, it's destined towards this hard turn of like, I'm out, I can't do this anymore. And so I think on the religious side, there's unfortunately an inability to be very honest about how hard it is. And I think it's very isolating inside the church, especially because if you're having problems in your marriage, where do you go with that? Because if you're in like a relationship with people, it gets uncomfortable because they know your spouse. And so how can you talk bad about them? Yeah, community. So it gets really messy. The church is supposed to proclaim a message that's like, it's okay to be messy. Like, that's why we have faith because God is perfect. We're not. Like, that's why we come to God. Yes, unfortunately, religion creeps in to the spiritual idea and it creates this space of like, I want to present a really beautiful front on Sunday. And then no matter how hard it is, I'm just supposed to suffer through it. One day it'll get better. And eventually you get tired of waiting. So that's kind of the religious. On the personal side, I think I definitely adopted some of that idea within my own marriage of things are hard, but marriages go through hard times. I mean, my parents lasted 50 years, and I attribute that majority of the time to my mom, and her commitment to it. But they were Midwestern, so it's just like this is what we do, right? Like, so it's like, oh, marriages have potentially years of difficulty. It's going to turn. Like, this is a bad trajectory, but it'll be an upswing, and then there's a lot of prayer and then being shocked, partly because I don't think we had developed a very healthy, honest, like to the point of hurting each other. Like, I don't like you anymore. Like, we're different people than when we were in our 20s when we got married out of college, obviously. But how do you have that conversation when you've built a life, especially as a pastor, where you've built a life around a spiritual community? And so the expectations on the pastor and his family are such that how can you get to a point where you say, like, this isn't working and this is not what I want anymore? Now my career is involved, right? This is our financial livelihoods at stake. Yeah, and our identity, so much of it at stake. And to get to that point, I think to your point on ego in terms of blinding myself, I do think I blinded myself to the possibilities of it ending, and then what would that mean? And there was a lot of fear in that. It's like for sure. And then our marriage broke, and it was the result of her infidelity was the final straw. Now we had a lot of problems, but when that happened, that was the end of my time in ministry. As I brought that to our board, they asked me to step down and because we didn't know the future, of what was going to happen. It was likely headed towards divorce, but that was too messy for the church.
So for that, even though you were the pastor, your wife was fidelity, but it was still you were the ones the church turned their back on instead of being like, wow, you were like your lowest hardest time navigating. when community is supposed to be there for you, they really were.
Yes, that was hard, and not just for me, but for her and our kids as well. I think we were both in a very low season and need of care, and that was the challenge dynamic. And unfortunately, I think the reality of most religious environments, they become transactional. That the pastor serves a purpose, and when they stop serving that purpose, then they're no longer needed. And unfortunately, that's religion at its ugliest. And it was incredibly painful. That was a very dark time. It happened the week I was turning 40, and it was like, okay, I'm losing my marriage, I'm losing my ministry, I'm losing my job.
Easy losing my youth.
Yes, what have I just spent the last 20 years building towards, and here we are. So it was a shock to the system for sure. There are plenty of people within the community and lifelong friends that rallied that I could trust. And there were some lifelong friends that aren't local, in the city that I had turned to for years to kind of say, "Hey, here's what's going on. I need to finally tell somebody, and I need to figure out what's going on." So they were there in that moment. And yeah, I think without those friends, there were some really low, dark moments. And I think without them, I don't know what would have happened. So I was very thankful for them and therapy and and other really intensive therapy practices and things I've done.
So, have you started therapy earlier on, like pre all this happening? How old were you? You were like, okay, the church can give me XYZ, but I still need ABC, and I'm going to get it from another source of
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah. I think for the longest time, it was like inside of our faith, the Bible is all you need. Yeah. Um, and
One size fits all.
yes, yes. And so I started going to therapy when I started to experience signs of burnout. So that was it was about 4 years into ministry, about 8 years into marriage. That's when I started to go to therapy and went through a few different therapists. And I'd been with the same therapist for a while before this all happened. And so I continued with her for for all the way through the end of the divorce. And then I also went to what I would call Christian Hoffman. So
Yeah.
I know you went to Hoffman Institute and you talk about it often. I call it Christian Hoffman. It's called Awaken, and it was a 4 day intensive group therapy experience that was absolutely life changing. Yeah, I don't think I realized how low I had gotten and how much I had shrank as a person as a result of trying to save my marriage, trying to figure out what to do. I think there was so much codependency in our marriage that was unhealthy that I had kind of retreated from a life that I enjoyed. And so it kind of felt like a restart of okay, let's rebuild and discover who am I now on the other side of this. And that was massive for me. It totally changed the trajectory of my life.
That's gotta be really hard though. Because it's like it's facing your own.
Well, yeah. Well, I didn't like that. It'd be much easier for me to blame, right? And to go "Oh, it wasn't really my fault," and be bitter. And I think that really forced me to deal with forgiveness that I needed to do for my own sake, and then bitterness and go "I can't live with this. That's bad for me." And so how do I confront that? How do I move past that so we can build a future? We have kids that are amazing. Let's focus on them and their future. And so that's been the focus is how do we co-parent? How do we establish new lives? And how do we do what's best for them? And then how do we begin to rebuild and figure out what the future will
Oh, okay. So you went to the program. It's 4 days. What's it look like after the program? Is there follow up? Are there things that you intentionally do? Kind of, was there a moment in which you were like at the program, where like, oh, okay, this is who I am. This is who I want to be. And when I get back, like, this is how it looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah, there definitely is kind of, I would say, personal commitments more than commitments from the program. And because I was introduced to it through close friends, they knew they had gone through it. So then I went through it. So we had some common language. And so that allows, for us to be able to kind of talk to it openly, which is good. And it's hard to translate that experience to people who haven't had it. It's it feels a little cultish when you describe some of the stuff that you do.
Just, I was on an event this morning, and there was a girl who also done Hoffman, and we immediately like went to each other, hugged. We weren't even in the same group.
Yeah.
We went to each other, hugged each other, and it was like no one else existed in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it also, to your point about confronting your own, it really forces you to take radical ownership of what you contributed to everything that went wrong. and to go, if I'm going to give ownership to everything that went wrong, how do I take ownership about the life I want to live going forward? And so it became a huge commitment for me of, okay, let's go after the way I want to live every day, the life I want to build in the future, and take ownership of I have responsibility to create that. And that's for my kids, that's for me, that's for the co-parenting relationship, for the divorce process, all of that. What am I going to contribute to that? What am I going to invest in it? Doesn't matter how other people react to it. How am I going to pursue that? And so we've adopted a process that I think is the healthiest for our kids. And we do nesting, which means the kids stay put in one home, and then we rotate in and out. And so it's like the kids have the apartment, and it's a kid's apartment, and that's what they have as stability. And so that's their home. And then we rotate in and out on the days that we're not responsible as the parent there. So it's it's a little disruptive to our personal lives, but
But your kids also didn't ask for divorce. It's like
no,
you're seeing selfless act, but you guys know something you do it.
yeah, so noble of us. No, it's some of it is practical. New York City is tough. We have 3
Yeah.
kids, so finding an apartment that we could all fit in, especially as they're teenagers. But also they are teenagers, so they can come and go, and our relationships are not defined by days, right? So that is also helpful. So yeah, it's trying to figure out how do they feel as much stability, how do they not feel as much disruption. It's already disruption, like the family they knew is changing, and like you said, they didn't ask for that. Our choices, our relationship led to that. So how do we, create a scenario where as much as possible, they are continuing on the life that they want to create and we can support that.
Do you think that, like, from your personal and your experience, like, are there sometimes people just genuinely and they're sort of seeking grace in a situation because you really are such a different person. You are in your 20s, you are in your 30s, 40s, 50s, then like, well, my year is this wrong, so this is very still my husband. So
Yes.
different iterations of him are now looking back kind of when you're married and looking for a teacher for your next relationship, maybe another long-term partner. Are there themes, tips, wisdom, advice that you'd give someone to be like, hey, this is how you grow together, it's to grow apart, or how do you intentionally show up, not just for yourself, but also your partner and like an insightful and a great activity.
Yeah, I think that is that's a challenge. I think there are a few elements that I think about a lot. Yeah, I got married at 23, right out of college. I went from I went from college roommates to having a wife. So I had never really lived alone until now. So that's a whole new learning experience. But I think part of that is you think you know who you are, and in the 20s, that's who you are. But when life starts to come about, you change. Parenting changes you, careers change you, where you live, the community that you're surrounded, you're influenced by. So I think being able to give each other freedom inside a relationship to become different people, but to invite each other into that journey as well. As you are growing and changing, as your thoughts about the future are changing, how does someone get invited into that? And how do you shape that together? I do think there was, a different timeline that we could have lived on where it was like, oh, we don't want to be this way anymore. How do we shift? And how do we build that together? When I think about couples who we got married around the same time of many of our college friends, being in Texas, that's what you do. You get a ring by spring is what they jokingly talk before you graduate. Like there's a lot of young marriages.
Or us degree.
Some, yes, some cases. But I have a lot of friends that I admire how they've navigated life challenges. Some of them, some of my best friends who navigated the loss of children, children with special needs, that 89% of marriages don't last when that happens. And yet they have. They just celebrate their 20th anniversary and watching that up close as they came together through hardship. Hardship has an ability to come together in that sense. So one is just your own natural life journey. I think the second is how do you deal with your wounds of life? Your childhood trauma that whether it's small trauma or big trauma, we all bring that, into these relationships and will you do the work as an individual to confront and heal those? Or will you bring that into the relationship that actually could cause a separation of intimacy? Because how can your partner know you if you haven't really delved into like the challenges that of your internal struggles? Because then you can't deal with the insecurities that you face, you can't deal with your own wounds and pain. And if you can't do that individually, it's the marriage I don't think is it's not possible for it to grow into something new. So I think there's a lot of I would call it like interdependence that needs to grow instead of codependency, where each of you can be individual and have your own individual lives, but then you come together, and build something together. So there's got to be some overlap in that Venn diagram. You have to be individual enough and then collective enough. So I think of marriage in terms of lovers, friends, and partners. Like, how can you become those three things together? So how can you have a face-to-face lover relationship where it's just the two of us? How can you become friends, where you're side by side in community alongside of that, but also partners that are building something together? But then added to that, how can you be individuals? You have your own things that you want to do. I may not want to do those. Like, I'm not a hiker. You like to go hiking? Find some friends to go hiking with. Like, I'm a city kid. Like that's not me.
You're not like camp in the woods.
Absolutely. So it's like how do you give each other that freedom? And I think Esther Perel, she's so beautiful about the description of relationship. She talks about, but the separate, and the together she talks about. And I think that separateness actually is what drew you together in the first place. This was a different person than you. And you were drawn to them and how they think about life. How do you let them continue that? Because you're still going to be drawn to that relationship.
That's something like one of these interesting things where kids are like the greatest joy in the world, and the majority of the brutal divorces that I've seen in the past few years are even if it just seems to fall apart. There seems to be so much resentment. How do you navigate by doing the most important thing you probably ever do, which is like bring a child along with being awesome parent with balancing, your relationship with your partner? Because I think as a kid, I always like my parents first, but it's also because they separated when I was 2 and they couldn't stand each other. So I was so easy to put first, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things I also think about that, which is so interesting, is that like maybe that is actually the reason why it all fell apart was because I didn't such the focus of their energy of love when they forgot about their love for each other. How do you
Yeah.
how do you balance being amazing, wonderful, involved, emotional parent with also still giving energy and time to your partner? Because there is less and less time for more beings you bring into the world.
Yeah. And I would say no doubt that may have been a contributing factor, but not the only. I think kids can be an easy distraction if things are hard in marriage. And so you can turn your attention to a kid because they're more fun than the problems with your spouse. And so I think that's one of the things that you start to give attention to. But I think to the point, like what happens with kids is your identity grows, but often people let their identity shrink. So you're adding a new identity. Now I'm a father. But that doesn't change the fact that, I was an engineer, that I love sports, that I have all these other loves, right? And now I've added the love of a kid to that. But most of the time, you remove all these other identities, and now your identity comes wrapped up in being a parent. And so I think in my coaching and even in therapy, there's a thing called parts therapy, where you're tapping into different parts of who you are, like a puzzle that makes up who you are. And so if you're not giving time and attention to your passions and of each of these pieces, you feel like something's missing and parts of you begins to die. And then you feel that because you are letting go of the whole person of who you are. And so when I coach leaders and founders, it becomes easy for them to get so obsessed with the organization that they've stopped enjoying life. And so many times I'm coming into that where they've established their business, they're excited about that, but they feel like they're not satisfied with life anymore. And so what's happened is they've given so much of their attention. And so I think parents can do the same with kids. They've sacrificed so much of actually the parts of them that is not attached to a kid that they're not even attractive to their partner anymore because they're not a whole person. And so that's where they begin to veer apart pretty easily with kids. And I don't think it's that the second or the third or the fourth or fifth kid, like is the cause. I think it finally just magnifies that because you have even less energy, after that because you have to divide your attention to different souls. And so it's like, how do you do that well? And I have a friend who she talks often about how she wishes she would have adopted a co-parenting model that she now has in divorce while she was married. And she always gets a lot of critique for that. Like, how can you think about that? But in co-parenting, you have to do a lot more negotiation, just like you talk about with prenups. Like you have to talk openly about who's going to do what. Who's going to pay for this? Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to be the one that's present for after school or drop off? Who this week? I have a busy week. Can you take on more? Like when you co-parent, you negotiate more about parenting responsibilities than when you were in a marriage. And you begin, and again, you default to these assumptions that, oh, you're going to take on more because that's just the role we play in marriage, because that's the role I saw my parents play. Instead of going, I'm not interested in that role. Like, and let's sit down and put it on paper. Who's gonna cook? Who's gonna clean up? Like, who's gonna be responsible, for all these different pieces of it? And so I do think there's something to that concept of treat each other as co-parents in this and negotiate with it, not as separate entities, but hopefully as a way to bring you together.
I was at an event recently. I laughed out loud when this guy said this, but now I reflect back on it, and he goes, "Oh yeah, my fiance and I are co-founders of our future together."
Yeah.
And I was like, "That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard." And then about a few hours later, I was like, "That's actually kind of lovely and not totally wrong," because at the end of the day, right? It is you're laying down the foundation and you're laying out the plan of what you want in your relationship. It shouldn't
Yes.
just be that for your company, a business, or whatever else you're starting, right? That you're putting so much energy and effort into. It's like, yeah, I feel like we're so good about putting energy, effort, time, and laying out plans for business,
Yes.
but we forget to like sit down and actually write down what we want in our life.
Well, and that is a big part of my approach to coaching is that I talk about work-life alignment more than work-life balance, because it's like you have a vision for your life and work should serve that, not be the only thing that is that. And so it's really helping people wrestle with how do all these things work together as opposed to pull you apart. What are you actually wanting out of life? And I think, I built it off of a psychologist that invented family systems theory where it's like the environment that you're building, you're playing a role in that. And if you just kind of fall into a role, unless you intentionally wrestle with how you want to show up. And so it's about how do you show up into this family. And I talk to my clients often of like, you create a great business plan, but when you go home, you stop that planning at the door. Like, that doesn't make sense because it is a family business. The entire reason that you are trying to earn money is to bless and build a family like that hopefully you then pass on an inheritance to, and you're creating a pattern for the generations that follow you that are healthy. That's a family business. Eventually you might have a family office if you do that really, really well. Well, like, how do you embrace that mindset? So I love the idea of like we're co-founders of a future. And I think that's true of anybody that's single as well. You're building a future that you want. What is the life that you're going to want to bring somebody into? So it's not just, couples. And I think it's a mentality that everyone can kind of embrace of I'm building a family business and I'm building a business or I'm building a career. Both of those things are true.
So, okay. So now with the work that you're doing with coaching, do you do individual coaching, couples coaching? Like, what is your focus now? What type of coaching?
I mean, it kind of varies. I've done all of that, so I typically work with individuals, typically that are business leaders in either the department that they're in within their company or in the C suite in some form of role. Sometimes I work with teams of partners and founders. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs. And part of that is being in the church planning world as long as I was a spiritual leader and, a business leader. It's a business. The church has to sustain. So I knew that tension. And part of that is I was also building a family while building a career. And that's tough. It's tough to have young kids and a young business. So how do you do that well? And so a lot of what happened is I was just building my own tools to stay sane and stay at peace. And then I started offering that and people were like, I need more of this. And so that's how it began to get created and launched. And then some of my clients will say, hey, will you work with us as a couple? Sometimes that's because they do have a family business or each of them have individual businesses and they want to balance that dynamic. So I will work with couples if they invite me into that. But the majority of my executive coaching is approaching either their business and their career planning, and then I help them navigate their life alongside of that. And a few times it is focused purely on life coaching. Like, how do I feel good on my career, but I haven't translated that into a healthy dynamic at home. So, how do I take that intentionality that I have in my career and apply it into my home? And so it really is customized to the client, partly because the diversity of experience that I had allows for me to say, what do you need in particular? And how do we begin to work together on that?
I know that I'm like our single, young couple are so different, but are there a few, I would say, like best practices or maybe habits that you see individuals and their couples adopt to have successful relationships?
Yes, absolutely. I would say number one is a regular planning meeting on the calendar. So I call it a navigation meeting, and I've created kind of a framework for people to have like just set off an hour time and figure out when that is, make it a comfortable setting. Each of you split apart for 30 minutes of your own individual planning and then come together and share what do you got going on this week? What do I have going on this week? What do we have going on? And because what tends to happen, especially when kids get into the picture, is every day is 1,000 decisions and 1,000 logistics that you're just juggling. And you're going, are you taking them? Am I taking them? And so if you bring that into 1 hour of time, now you've created a lot of margin for actual relationship. So it's like a business meeting, right? Every business that's healthy has a regular staff meeting where you're like, this is what we're working on. These are our priorities this week. This is how we're going to do it. So I say, take that into the home. Like, what's the schedule? What's the money needs this week? How are we going to work on our health? What is the food plan for the week? Like, what is the relational plan for the week? What are you going to do for yourself? What am I going to do for myself? What do we need to do together? And when you begin to plan for that, you know that you're going to have a consistent time to bring any problems to the table of like, hey, I haven't talked about this, but I want to share this with you. And so you have that time set aside where you're planning together because you are a family business. So I'd say number one is a regular business meeting that you have on the calendar that you know you're not going to miss. And it's non negotiable because it can be easy to go, oh, well, there's something came up. It's like, no, if we don't do this, we're going to get off. And it's just those slight little veering away that eventually you look up and you don't know the person next. So that's one. I think two is, I think about baby mama in this where her boss is like 5 minutes of uninterrupted eye contact, where and it's so awkward. But I think about like having time where it's like all I have is you, and all we're gonna do is connect and talk. Well, it could be a date night, it could be coffee, it could be after the kids go to bed, and all we have is this, where it's like there's the phones are away, the TV's away. What's going on with you? I'm just gonna listen. You tell me what's going on with you. If you don't have that regular connecting point, it begins to break down everything else. It breaks down sex, it breaks down money, it breaks down health. Like we were made to connect, and marriage is meant to be the most intimate of connections. But that requires so much communication. And men, me, I can tell you from my own experience, I was terrible at that for a very long time. And it took a long time for me to figure out how do I express my own needs, my own wants, to listen without being offended of like, what do you want from me? Oh, I'm not providing that, and to not view myself as a big failure and deal with guilt and shame, but actually receive that and go like, you're making a request to me. How do I meet that? But creating that space so there's business and relational connection. And the last piece I would say is memory making. I think that was one of the things that was huge when our kids were younger. That was the healthiest thing we did is Saturday mornings were for making memories. And, because you go into the weekend and you're like, I'm tired, you're tired. Like we would rather sleep. But our kids are coming into it with like, we're excited. It's Saturday. Like, let's go. And so the best thing we did was Saturday mornings were for memory making. And then the rest of the Saturday could actually be more relaxed. And so those are the three things I think that come to mind of a business meeting, of connection time, and then making memories that I think are best practices.
I love that. There's this one couple right now in the city that I can more about their things every Friday to be on happy hour
Yes.
where they come home to the kids. And it's like, it was so cute when I found out, and I love their relationship, and I love their respect of each other. And there was a moment I was like, oh, I get it now. Because you guys actually, even if it's just for an hour each Friday, but before you come home with the chaos, like you have that time. And they also, it was really interesting, like, not how rough with each other are they? Like they're silent. One of them needs help with something. Do it. Very much they have their own.
Right.
Which is so important.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful.
But this was so good. This was amazing. Ended on such a good note.